Thanks, Erica. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for taking time to join us for this really fascinating and important topic. So when we're talking about sexuality and gender identity, I'm just going to say a few things by way of introduction to sort of seed our discussion. And then when we go into discussion together, I hope that you'll all be able to share your perspectives and the group wisdom. And then if there are places where I need to step in to provide information that you might need, I'm happy to do that. But really, this is the part of the evening where I'm going to do most of the talking. And then I hope to become sort of a participant facilitator in the conversation that we all have after this. So, when we think about, well, first of all, I want to say that the title of this parent coffee, Sexuality and Gender Identity, let's just talk about that word sexuality for a second, because, that word can have multiple meanings depending upon who's using it. When I use that word, I use it very holistically to talk about our, the sort of integration of our body, our mind, our heart, our actions, and our reactions to the world we live in. Some people use the word sexuality as a synonym for sexual orientation. And so when they say sexuality, they mean is somebody gay or straight or bisexual or demisexual or any of the myriad names that we have to identify how people are attracted to or fall in love with other people. But when we're talking about sexuality and gender identity tonight, I want to also make the distinction between talking about sex and talking about gender. So as an English teacher, I have, sometimes it actually helps me in my role as a sexuality educator. And, I always say to kids in my sexuality classes, sex can be a noun or a verb. It can be a thing you do, or it can be a thing you are. And here we're talking about sex as a noun, as a thing you are. So sex refers to biology, and biology refers to a whole collection of aspects of our personhood, including chromosomes and hormones and genitals and internal structures and just lots of things that go into making us a physical being. But gender, if there's a quippy saying that I don't really like, but I sometimes will use because it makes an important distinction, so that our sex is between our legs, but our gender is between our ears. When we're talking about gender, we're really talking about one's internal sense of self. And a couple of things we know about gender identity. Interestingly, what we don't know is a lot bigger than what we know in many ways. So we don't know exactly. It's clearly got some biological aspect, but we don't know. We can't map the part of the brain that contains a person's gender identity, and we've not yet been able to create any kind of clear, definitive biological connections to what creates or influences or enforces or reinforces our gender identity. What we do know is that people, starting at around the age of 2, maybe 3, begin to have a sense of themselves as gendered in some way. Now, we don't have any kind of language at that age to understand that or express that, but basically, there's a voice inside our head that tells us who we are. And that voice lives in relationship to the physical bodies that we inhabit. And for lots of people, that voice in our head and that physical body we inhabit are in some or a great deal of agreement. So we feel kind of at home. Our physicality and that thing inside, that voice inside our head, feel in alignment in some way. And we call that being cisgender. So I am a cisgender man because my physicality is male. Male is a biology word. And my gender identity is man. So that's called cisgender. For other folks, their sense of themselves and the physicality that they inhabit are not in agreement. Could be a little, could be a lot. And the broad category for talking about that is to talk about transgender. Trans meaning across. We know a lot more about trans folks and especially trans kids than we have in the last, the amount of research and study and awareness, cultural awareness of trans folks has skyrocketed in the last 15, 20 years. And I think it's important for us, we adults, to recognize that the world our kids are growing up in terms of gender and the way gender is looked at, may be vastly different than the world that we grew up in. Because most of us grew up in a world and a culture where gender was thought to be very binary. You're either this or this. And gender was pretty rigidly policed and enforced by a whole host of social institutions. That's really different today. So kids are growing up today in a world, and of course, depending upon where they go to school and who they're socializing with, and but the world today is much more open to the reality that gender is not binary. It's not this or this. There's a huge range of gender identities and a huge range of gender expressions, how we show that to the world. And also, there is much more openness to the sense that the journey to reconcile, come to understand, find one's truth around gender is more, I would say, experiential today than it has been before. So it is not uncommon for kids today, little kids and big kids, to, as they are sort of moving through the process of becoming, to try on different labels for themselves, different identity markers, perhaps different pronouns at different points in their lives, as a way of trying to figure out, who am I? That's not an option that most of us who are adults today had when we were growing up. We were basically told, this is the box that you're in, and that's it. That's your option. Live in the box. Today, the boxes are porous. And that can be very disconcerting to folks. And I appreciate that. It's not disconcerting to me because this is the work I do, and I'm very used to this. But what I would say to you as we start our conversations is, I don't worry when kids talk about different identity labels as they're growing up. What I'm interested in, what I look for as a sexuality educator, are not any one moment of disclosure or identification, but I look for patterns. So if a kid is consistently telling me something about their identity, and that only seems to get more true for them as we go along, then that really is something I want to pay attention to and acknowledge and honor. But we don't have to, every time a kid makes a declaration about who they are, it's not good today for us to think of that as, well, that's a kind of like bell you can't unring, or that's a door you can't pass back through. Because we may find things flexing and changing, and there's just more openness for that today. So I think that's important to think about. There were two specific questions that were sent to us beforehand, and I do want to address both of them before we go into our conversation, because I think that they also help us in sort of an overview. So the first question may seem kind of clinical, but I'll declinicalize it. So the question is gender dysphoria a psychiatric problem, parentheses, in the DSM? I'll explain that in a second. And if so, is there a therapy or treatment for it? So gender dysphoria is defined as a person who is in significant distress about some conflict they're experiencing around their gender identity and their potentially their physicality. So, so a kid or an adult is feeling a significant amount of anxiety, stress, depression, agitation, upset, sadness about their inability to reconcile the difference that they're feeling between something inside their head that feels very true and some outside situation in their world that great, Erica, that that is not allowing them to express that. So not every trans kid, not every non-binary kid, not every agender kid, not every kid who is um, who is trying on different gender identities has gender dysphoria. As a matter of fact, the thing that exacerbates gender dysphoria and the thing that makes it a sort of psychological psychiatric problem is when a kid is restricted or forbidden or not allowed to express the truth that they know about themselves or live the truth that they know about themselves. So kids who grow up with an openness that the world around them allows them to flex, feel, try, seek truth are not kids who have gender dysphoria. They may feel like there's a disconnect between their mind and their body, but they also see there are many different ways that that can be addressed. There are options, and those options can be anything from um, external manifestations, so changing styles of hair or dress or adornment. That may be, for example, puberty blockers for kids who are just beginning puberty and are fearing that their bodies are going to change in a way that fundamentally feels not who they are. Or that may be, for example, a community allowing a child to use a different name or use different pronouns, acknowledging that child's name or pronouns. That's what actually stops gender dysphoria. So the very fact that somebody is trans or gender nonconforming or agender does not equal having gender dysphoria as a diagnosable psychiatric condition. What makes it a psychiatric condition is the trauma of having a struggle around this and not being able to have a resolution that that allows somebody to live their truth. So that's the first question. The second question, why is transgenderism more prevalent now than it was some years ago? Is it because we're more open as a society? I think there's not one answer to this question. I think there's many answers to this question. Yes, we are more open as a society to the very, to just in acknowledging that trans people exist and that trans people are not, you know, somehow depraved or weird or other, that trans is a part of our human family. So that's part of it. I think also, as we have gotten more comfortable with differences in sexual orientation, as the LGBTQ community has had more oxygen and more exposure, I think that has helped us. I think that our continuing evolution of thinking about gender and battling sexism and toxic masculinity is another thing, because the more we allow gender to become expressive and expansive and not rigid and binary, the more the world seems like a place that, of course, would have trans people in it. And we would begin to acknowledge that as a normal part of our world. So I think there's a lot of reasons for why we're seeing more. Are we seeing more kids identify as trans or gender nonconforming or things like that? You know, Probably. Does that mean there are more kids now than there were before? I don't think so. I think it just means that kids have the option of voicing it now, which I see as a really positive development. So certainly in the work that I do and in my teaching and certainly in my school, I'm very happy to say that that we have worked to be a community that that is open, that gives oxygen, that acknowledges each individual child's journey, and that really has as its goal not for us to determine the truth about any child and who they are, but for the child to be able to explore, express, and acknowledge their truth, and for us to be able to honor that. So that's, if I had a sort of a goal for us as a society, that would be it. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of gender. We're not moving towards a genderless society. That's never going to happen. We are always going to have strong identifications as man and woman in our society. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's not a zero-sum game. Allowing trans and gender diverse kids and adults to be does not diminish those of us who identify in a more typical or a more traditional, perhaps, it's hard to find the wording for this, gender identities. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Erica.